Imagine walking through a canyon in Colorado and discovering a city built into the face of a cliff. Over 150 rooms carved and stacked into the stone, perfectly preserved, with cooking pots still sitting on hearths, tools laid out in order, grain stored in jars. And no one inside. No bodies, no sign of fire or battle, just silence and the wind. More than 30,000 people once lived in this landscape. By the year 1300, every single one of them was gone. What happened? That question sat unanswered for nearly 600 years. The answer, when science finally found it, was stranger and darker than anyone had expected. In December of 1888, two ranchers named Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason were riding through the Mesa Verde plateau in southwestern Colorado, searching for stray cattle in the snow. The terrain was rough. Deep canyons cutting through the mesa, scrubby juniper and pinyon pine on the rims, cold wind funneling up from the gorges below. They had ridden this country before. They thought they knew it. Then, peering through the snow and the low winter light across one of the canyon walls, Wetherill stopped his horse. On the far side of the gorge, set back into an enormous natural alcove in the sandstone cliff, was a city. Not ruins scattered on the ground. A city, standing, with towers and walls and hundreds of rooms stacked on top of each other, all built from carefully cut stone, all sheltered under the curved roof of the rock overhang above. He named it Cliff Palace, and the name was exactly right. When the two men made their way down into the canyon and climbed up to the structure, what struck them was not the size, though the scale was astonishing, more than 150 rooms and over 20 circular underground chambers called kivas. What struck them was the condition. Things were where they had been left. Pottery sat on surfaces, stone tools rested in corners, doors were closed. In one room, a ceramic jar still held dried corn from the last harvest before the city was abandoned, more than 6 centuries earlier. It felt less like a ruin than like a house whose owner had just stepped outside momentarily and hadn't come back yet. Wetherill would return to Mesa Verde many times after that first December afternoon, exploring the canyon system and eventually discovering other major cliff dwellings in the same complex. Spruce Tree House, Square Tower House, and others, each similarly intact, each carrying that same quality of suspended time. He kept meticulous records of what he found, and those records eventually made their way to the Smithsonian Institution and other academic bodies, setting off a wave of archaeological interest that would continue for over a century. That feeling, the sense of a life suddenly interrupted, would become one of the defining puzzles of the site. Nothing about Cliff Palace looked like a place that had been abandoned. It looked like a place that was waiting. And the more archaeologists examined it over the following century, the more they would find that the story of why it was empty was not a simple one. It was a story of extraordinary human achievement followed by extraordinary human suffering, and the evidence was embedded in the stone and the bones and the ancient wood of the structures themselves. The people who built and lived in Cliff Palace are known today as the Ancestral Puebloans. For generations they were also called by the Navajo name Anasazi, a word that translates, depending on the source, as ancient enemies. Not ancient ones, ancient enemies. The Navajo people who lived in the region after the Exodus had their own understanding of who the builders of those cliff cities had been, and what it meant that they were gone. Before addressing why they left, it is worth spending time on who they were, because the scale and sophistication of what they built is the thing that makes their disappearance so profound. The Ancestral Puebloans did not leave behind a primitive camp. They left behind a civilization. Cliff Palace was constructed primarily between 1190 and 1260 CE, a period of roughly 70 years during which the builders cut and fitted tens of thousands of sandstone blocks, mixing mortar from ash and water and clay, building structures that rose 4 stories in places, all within the constraints of a natural alcove that determined the shape and footprint of the entire complex. The engineering involved was not accidental. The builders understood load distribution, drainage, and the properties of the local stone. They knew which rock faces provided the best protection from winter cold and summer heat. They oriented their structures to take advantage of passive solar warming. The circular underground chambers, called kivas, were among the most distinctive features of the architecture. These were not storage rooms or sleeping quarters. They were ritual spaces, semi-subterranean, accessible only from above through a hole in the roof, lined with benches and equipped with a central fire pit and a small hole in the floor called a sipapu, which represented the opening through which the first people had emerged from the underworld into this world. These were places of ceremony, of connection between the living and the spiritual order they believed governed everything from rainfall to harvest. The alignment of the structures with astronomical events was not accidental either. Researchers have documented that certain windows and doorways within the complex are positioned to catch the first light of the winter solstice sunrise, or to frame the precise position of the sun at the equinoxes. This was not decoration. In a society where the agricultural calendar was a matter of survival, knowing exactly when to plant and when to expect rain was essential knowledge, and the buildings were instruments for tracking that knowledge. Their water management was also remarkable. Living on stone in a semi-arid environment, they constructed check dams, collection basins, and channeling systems to capture and direct the limited rainfall the mesa received. They grew maize, beans, and squash in fields on the mesa top, climbing down and up the cliff face each day to tend their crops. The logistics of daily life in that location were demanding in a way that's hard to imagine from the outside. But they had made it work, generation after generation for nearly a century. And then something changed. Here is something that tends to get overlooked in discussions of the abandonment. The move to the cliff dwellings was not the original settlement pattern. It was a response to something that was already going wrong. Before approximately 1190 CE, the ancestral Puebloans of the Mesa Verde region lived primarily on the mesa tops, on the flat, open ground above the canyons, where farming was easier and movement was unrestricted. The cliff dwellings were not their traditional homes. The cliff dwellings were a choice they made under pressure, a decision to move their entire communities into locations that were defensively superior, but practically much more difficult to inhabit. You don't voluntarily move your family into a cliff face and climb a rope ladder every time you need to get your water, unless you have a compelling reason to do so. Defensive architecture is the archaeological term for structures built primarily with security in mind, rather than convenience. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are textbook examples. The only access points were narrow and easily controlled. The retractable wooden ladders that provided the main routes of entry could be pulled up to make the settlement entirely inaccessible from below. The natural overhang of the rock provided protection from above. A small group of defenders could hold the approaches against a much larger attacking force. This tells us something important about the period between 1190 and 1280. Something or someone had made the ancestral Puebloans feel unsafe on open ground. They reorganized their entire way of life around the need for protection. The question that archaeology spent decades trying to answer was, protection from what? Or from whom? There is no evidence in the historical and archaeological record of a major external power, a conquering empire, a large organized army from outside the region, moving through the Four Corners area during this period. The threat, whatever it was, appears to have been internal to the region itself. Neighbouring groups competing for the same resources. Conflict between communities that had once coexisted with some degree of stability. The pressure was building from within, and the cliff walls were the response. The scale of the response is worth emphasizing. Moving an entire community into a cliff dwelling was not a temporary measure. It required rebuilding homes, relocating food storage, redesigning the entire infrastructure of daily life. Retractable ladders that provided access, wooden poles that could be hauled up from above, leaving the cliff face smooth and unclimbable, speak to a very specific and practical fear. You design retractable access points when you expect to need to close them quickly. The people who built those ladders and those walls were not being cautious in the abstract. They were responding to something they had experienced or witnessed directly. In the 1920s, an astronomer named A.E. Douglas was working on a problem in solar physics when he accidentally became one of the most important figures in American archaeology. Douglas had been studying sunspot cycles and noticed that the annual growth rings in living trees varied in width in patterns that corresponded to wet years and dry years. Wide rings meant good rainfall and strong growth. Narrow rings meant drought and stress. He realized that if you could match the outer rings of an old dead tree to the inner rings of a living one, you could build a continuous record stretching back through time. Working with wood samples collected from the ceiling beams of ancient southwestern dwellings, including structures at Mesa Verde, he eventually constructed a tree ring chronology that went back over 1,000 years. Dendrochronology, the science he helped establish, could now tell archaeologists not just when a structure was built, down to the specific year in many cases, but also what the climate had been doing year by year throughout its occupation. What the tree rings from the Mesa Verde region revealed about the late 13th century was unambiguous. Beginning in 1276 and continuing through 1299, the region experienced a drought of a severity and duration that was without precedent in the preceding 3 centuries of the record. Not a dry year or two, a sustained, grinding drought lasting more than 2 decades. The rings from those years are narrow to the point of near invisibility, year after year after year. The agricultural system of the Ancestral Puebloans depended on maize. Maize required consistent rainfall at specific periods of the growing season. A drought of this duration would have systematically destroyed crops year after year, depleting stored reserves that were never replenished. By the 1280s, the food supply across the entire Mesa Verde region would have been in serious collapse. But here is the complication that makes the drought theory insufficient on its own. The Ancestral Puebloans had survived droughts before. The tree ring record shows earlier periods of low rainfall that the society weathered and recovered from. Drought alone does not explain why this time, unlike every previous time, they did not stay and endure. Something else was happening simultaneously, something that turned a natural crisis into a human catastrophe from which recovery was impossible. Archaeology is patient. It takes decades of careful excavation and analysis to build a picture from what the earth gives back. In the case of the Ancestral Puebloans, what the earth eventually gave back from sites scattered across the Four Corners region that were contemporaneous with the Mesa Verde occupation was a record of violence so systematic and so severe that it fundamentally changed the scholarly understanding of what happened in the late 13th century. At a site called Sacred Ridge in Colorado, excavated in the early 2000s, archaeologists uncovered the remains of approximately 35 individuals in a pit. The remains were not simply buried, they were processed. The skulls showed blunt force trauma consistent with being struck with a stone tool or club. The long bones of the arms and legs had been broken in a pattern consistent with extraction of bone marrow, the same technique used to process animal bones for food after butchering. Distinctive cut marks on the bone surfaces, visible under microscopy, matched the patterns left by stone knives removing flesh from bone. The bodies had been dismembered, defleshed, and the bones cracked for their marrow content. This was not a battlefield. The victims included men, women, and children. The injuries were inflicted on people who were not in a position to fight back. This was a massacre of a civilian population, followed by systematic processing of the remains. The Sacred Ridge site is not unique. Bioarchaeological research across the broader region has identified multiple sites showing similar patterns of skeletal trauma from this period, evidence of organized violence against whole communities. The picture that emerges from the bones is one of a society under extreme stress, beginning to turn on itself in ways that went far beyond ordinary inter-community conflict. When food becomes critically scarce and the social frameworks that normally govern behavior begin to break down, the results can be catastrophic. Communities that had traded with each other and maintained diplomatic relations began competing for the same depleted resources. The cliff dwellings, built for defense, were now also increasingly necessary as protection against neighbors who were desperate enough to raid. The timeline matters here. The shift to cliff dwellings had begun around 1190, roughly 80 years before the Great Drought of 1276. This means the defensive reorganization of Mesa Verde society preceded the worst of the climate crisis. Whatever was generating fear and conflict had been present and growing for a long time before the drought pushed the situation past the point of return. The drought did not create the violence. It intensified pressures that were already structural, already embedded in the way the region's communities related to each other, and in doing so, it removed whatever margins of tolerance and cooperation that had previously kept those pressures from boiling over into the kind of organized violence the bones record. Of all the findings to emerge from the archaeological investigation of the Mesa Verde abandonment, one was so disturbing that it took decades for the scientific community to fully accept it. And when it was finally confirmed, it generated controversy that went well beyond academic circles. The evidence came from a site in southwestern Colorado, excavated in the 1990s. Among the material recovered from a collapsed structure were fragmentary human bones, showing the same defleshing and marrow extraction marks documented at Sacred Ridge. But the researchers also found something else at this site: coprolites, which is the technical term for fossilized human feces preserved in the ancient hearth deposits.
A scientist named Richard Mahler applied biochemical analysis to these coprolite samples, testing for the presence of myoglobin, a protein found in human muscle tissue that is not normally present in feces unless human flesh has been consumed. The test was positive. Human myoglobin was present in the coprolite samples from the same hearth where the defleshed human bones had been found. The combination of evidence, the cut mark patterns on the bones, the marrow extraction, and the biochemical signature in the hearth deposits, constituted what researchers called the most direct physical evidence of cannibalism yet documented in the archaeological record of North America. Mahler's findings, published in the journal Nature in 2000, were immediately controversial. Some researchers objected on methodological grounds. Others raised the possibility of cultural misinterpretation. But the physical evidence was difficult to dismiss. Whether this represented survival cannibalism driven purely by starvation, or whether it also served as a form of psychological terror, consuming the remains of enemies to demonstrate absolute dominance, as some anthropological parallels suggest, is still debated. The archaeological evidence can show that it happened. It cannot tell us precisely what it meant to the people involved. What it does tell us is that by the late 1200s, the social and moral frameworks of ancestral Puebloan society had been pushed past a point of recovery. Whatever community bonds had held these populations together for generations were dissolving under the combined pressure of environmental collapse and violent conflict. No society operates on logistics alone. Every human community is held together by a shared understanding of how the world works and who has the authority to manage it, what we call, in various forms, religion and leadership. For the ancestral Puebloans, these were not separate categories. The ceremonial leaders, the individuals who controlled access to the kivas and managed the ritual calendar, were also the political authorities. Their power rested on a claim that they could intercede with the spiritual forces that governed rainfall, harvest, and the maintenance of order. When the drought began in 1276 and did not end, that claim was put to the test in 1940
the most direct possible way. The rituals were performed, the ceremonies were conducted, the prayers were made, and the rain did not come. Year after year, it did not come. Children grew up watching the crops fail. Adults watched stored food supplies that should have been reserves for lean years disappear without being replenished. The elderly remembered better times and watched their world contract. Archaeological evidence from the final decades of occupation at Mesa Verde includes something telling. A number of kivas, the sacred underground chambers that were the physical heart of ancestral Puebloan spiritual life, show signs of deliberate destruction by fire. Not accidental fires, deliberately set. The burning was intentional, and in the context of what the evidence suggests about the state of the society at that time, the most plausible interpretation is that these burnings were acts of repudiation. Communities turning against the institutions and authorities that had failed them. The sacred centers of the world they had known being destroyed by the people who had once built and maintained them. There is also evidence from some sites of the arrival of new cultural influences from outside the region. Material culture suggesting the presence of people from other areas who brought different practices and possibly different social structures. Whether these were traders, refugees from other failing communities, or something more like a group imposing authority by force, is not clear from the archaeological record. But the period of the late 1200s appears to have been one in which Mesa Verde society was not merely stressed, but fragmenting, breaking along lines of resource access, community loyalty, and belief. The abandonment of Mesa Verde was not instantaneous. It was a process that played out over approximately 2 decades, from roughly the 1270s through the year 1300, as different communities made the decision to leave at different times under different immediate pressures. By around 1300, however, the process was complete. A landscape that had supported tens of thousands of people was empty. What the archaeological evidence shows about the manner of departure is itself significant. Many of the doorways at Cliff Palace and other cliff dwellings were carefully sealed before their occupants left. Stones fitted into the openings, mortar applied. Heavy objects were left behind: large ceramic storage jars, grinding stones, tools that would have been valuable but were too heavy to carry on a long overland journey. Some food stores were left in place. The dead were sometimes buried within the structures rather than simply abandoned. This is not the profile of a panicked flight. This is the profile of a planned departure. People who believed they would eventually return, who wanted to protect their possessions during what they may have imagined as a temporary absence, who took the time to close up their homes before they walked away. The tragedy embedded in this evidence is considerable. They left expecting to come back, and they never did. The journey itself was extraordinary by any measure. The destination for most of the refugees appears to have been the Rio Grande Valley, several hundred kilometers to the south and southeast, into what is now New Mexico and Arizona. The Four Corners region offered abundant archaeological evidence of where people went after Mesa Verde. Sites in the Rio Grande area show a sudden population increase in the late 1200s and early 1300s, a demographic spike consistent with the arrival of a large migrating population from the north. The migrants had no horses. Horses would not arrive in the American Southwest until the Spanish brought them in the 16th century. They traveled on foot across some of the most demanding terrain in North America: canyon country, desert plateaus, stretches of waterless rock. They carried what they could manage, which was necessarily limited: children, elderly people who could not move fast, seed corn for future planting, the essential tools of a farming life, and the accumulated ceremonial knowledge that was stored in memory rather than objects. The oral traditions, the ritual calendars, the understanding of the spiritual geography of the world, all of this traveled with the people, in the minds and voices of the elders and the ceremonial specialists who kept it. When they arrived in the river valleys to the south, brought that knowledge with them, and they used it to build again. For most of the 20th century, the story of the Ancestral Puebloans was told as a mystery with no ending. A people who had appeared, built their remarkable cities, and then vanished. The word vanished appeared in countless books and documentaries. It was not accurate, but it served the narrative of mystery well. The scientific tools that eventually corrected this narrative came from 2 directions: chemistry and genetics. The first was strontium isotope analysis. Strontium is an element that occurs in different isotopic ratios in different geological environments. It enters the food chain through soil and water, and it becomes incorporated into tooth enamel during childhood, forming a kind of chemical signature of where a person grew up. By analyzing strontium isotope ratios in the teeth of skeletal remains found at Mesa Verde sites, and comparing those ratios to the geological profiles of other regions, researchers could track the movement of individuals. The analysis confirmed migration patterns consistent with movement toward the Rio Grande region. The second was ancient DNA. Modern genetic techniques have advanced to the point where usable DNA can sometimes be extracted from skeletal material that is centuries old. Researchers compared genetic profiles from ancient remains at Mesa Verde area sites with DNA samples collected from living members of the Pueblo and Hopi communities of the American Southwest. The results were definitive. The Hopi people of northeastern Arizona, the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, and other indigenous communities of the region are the direct biological descendants of the Ancestral Puebloans. They did not vanish. They moved. They rebuilt. They survived. The Hopi oral traditions include accounts of a time when their ancestors lived in great stone cities in the north, when darkness and violence came upon those cities, when the people were forced to leave and find new homes along the rivers to the south. These oral accounts, preserved across generations without writing, describe the same events that the tree rings and the bones and the strontium isotopes record in their own scientific languages. The people who built Cliff Palace are still alive. Their descendants live and work in communities that have maintained cultural continuity with their cliff-dwelling ancestors for over 700 years. The Hopi word for themselves, Hopi, means the peaceful people, or the people of peace. Whether that name carries within it some memory of the violence that ended their time in the cliff cities, some aspiration that shaped the identity of the survivors as they rebuilt their lives along the rivers of the South, is something that only the Hopi themselves can speak to. What the archaeology and the genetics and the isotope chemistry confirm is that the line connecting Cliff Palace to the living communities of the modern Southwest is unbroken. The story of Mesa Verde is, at its foundation, a story about what happens when an environment reaches the limits of what it can sustain, and a society reaches the limits of what it can absorb. The Ancestral Puebloans built something genuinely remarkable. They engineered solutions to difficult problems. They created art and ceremony and systems of knowledge that have outlasted the stone buildings themselves, preserved in the living memory of their descendants. And then the climate shifted, in a direction that their engineering could not compensate for, and the social bonds that held their communities together came apart under the weight of scarcity and fear. None of those elements is unique to the 13th century. The combination of a climate shift that disrupts agricultural systems, resource scarcity that produces competition and violence, institutional authority that loses legitimacy because it cannot deliver what it promises, and social fragmentation that turns communities against each other. These are not historical curiosities. They are patterns that recur across human history at every scale, from a canyon civilization in Colorado to civilizations that operated across continents. The tree rings that told us about the Great Drought of 1276 to 1299 are still being read. Researchers today use the same techniques that Douglas pioneered to build climate records stretching back thousands of years. Records that show how dramatically and how rapidly conditions in the American Southwest can shift. The same region where Cliff Palace stands empty has experienced significant drought conditions in the early 21st century. The aquifers and river systems that the modern Southwest depends on are under documented stress. This is not an argument that history will simply repeat itself in the same form. It is an observation that the evidence from Mesa Verde, evidence gathered from bones and tree rings and ancient chemistry, describes mechanisms and patterns that are still operating in the world today. The ancestral Puebloans did not fail because they were primitive or because they made foolish choices. They failed because the combined pressure of environmental and social crisis exceeded the capacity of any reasonable human response. Cliff Palace is still there today, in its alcove in the sandstone cliff face, preserved by the dry Colorado air. Every year, many thousands of visitors climb the trail to look at it. Most of them are struck by the same thing that stopped Richard Wetherill on his horse in the winter snow in 1888. How present it all feels, how close. The cooking pots and the closed doors and the kiva benches still waiting, oriented toward the sipapu in the floor, the opening through which the first people emerged. The city is not abandoned. It is waiting still, as it has been for 7 centuries, for the people who sealed their doors and walked south and never returned.